All right, everyone. Our screencast today is going to focus on slavery and specifically slavery developing in British North America. So when we were discussing this in class, I felt like a few of you guys were confused because we have introduced slavery already, uh, but slavery hasn't really taken off in our class in North America, the British colonies of North America. So we primarily discussed slavery as it was concerned with it coming into the Spanish colonies, the Caribbean islands, which are British, French, and Spanish, and a little bit of the lower south of British North America. So we started to talk about how it's developing in the rest of British North America today. So we discussed Bacon's Rebellion a little bit, and its potential impact on the slave trade in the North American British colonies. So we're just going to briefly kind of go through the slave trade, and then we're going to kind of pick up more kind of looking regionally, because one thing that a lot of people don't understand is that slavery is not just a southern institution in the colonial period. It's also a part of the North, it's a part of the Middle colonies, the New England colonies, and so we're going to talk about differences as far as culture and slavery in different parts of the British colonies. So one of the things that we discussed is that overall, if you compare slaves going to different parts of the New World, British North America is not receiving that many comparatively to, say, Brazil, Portuguese Brazil, or the Caribbean islands. And there's reasons for why that is. And it really has to do with the conditions in these other areas of North America and how really the death rate of slaves in, say, the Caribbean or in other South American countries. And then also it has to do with the fact that although we don't import that many slaves into British North America, they're going to use the slave population to be a self-replicating slave population. This is more of the same information about kind of the slave trade, just a different visual of where people are going. And as you guys know, we discussed this in class, this is a part of the triangular trade that's taking place. And something that we're going to see is that New England is not that involved in importing slaves to New England, but they are very involved in this triangular trade and picking up slaves in the Caribbean and transporting slaves in different parts of North America. All right, so when we look at this, we have to look at different regions. So we're first going to look at the southern British colonies. And the southern British colonies, if you look on the map here, it refers to two different areas. So we're looking here in this green color, which is Virginia, Maryland, which we're going to call the Chesapeake colonies. And then we're also going to look at this other area of the South that we're going to refer to as the lower South, so which is North Carolina, South Carolina, and eventually Georgia. And if you look overall, I might pause the video here and just take a look at it and maybe jot some ideas down. But if you look overall, what's happening here, this is showing you three areas of the British colonies: the Caribbean islands, the south of North America, and then the northern British colonies. And what you should notice is that basically as you're moving north, so from the Caribbean up, the population of slaves comparatively to the free population is getting smaller and smaller. In the Caribbean, it's huge. By the 1770s, almost 90% of the population. In the southern colonies, it never gets over 50%, but it's substantial. It's in some areas it's 40. In certain areas, it is over 50%. And then the northern mainland colonies, it never really gets too big. Certain colonies we will talk about have a bigger slave population than others, and New York is one of those places. So New York has a pretty substantial slave population, and it really has to do with the type of agriculture that's taking place in New York and a little bit in Pennsylvania as well. All right, so we're going to start with the lower South and the Chesapeake Bay. And what I want to start with is kind of this map, which kind of breaks it down for you here. So it's very hard to find exact numbers for the colonial period. So what we're going to look at is this map from 1790 quite a few times. And this map shows you the slave population after we become a country already, but it gives you a general idea of what the slave population was like. And if you look at it, the lower South has a substantial amount of slaves, and so does Virginia. Virginia really actually has the biggest slave population during this time period. And that really has to do with the type of agriculture that's happening there, and tobacco. which is really fueling the slave population of this era. And if you look state by state, this gives you an indication. Virginia and South Carolina are really your biggest uh, slave population states. Now, we'll come back to that. When you look at the slaves in the South, there are certain characteristics that are important about the way that they live and their lifestyle. So since they're living on plantations, uh, there is a substantial amount of slaves living on each plantation in the South. So it would be very rare in the South for somebody to be alone as a slave. It would be much more common to live in a larger group. So you might have 10, 15 slaves living on the same plantation. And when that's the case, uh, what's going to happen here is you're going to start to develop a culture. So you start to see a unique uh, African culture blending, so an African American culture blending in here in the British South. Now, it's not really that they're taking too much of British culture at the time. What they're really doing is taking African traditions and kind of molding them uh, into this new world because they're not all coming from the same places in Africa, and so sometimes they can't even communicate with each other. So a good term to know would be the charter generation of African slaves, and that means the first slaves who are coming over, they really have to overcome a lot of difficulties. And so they start to kind of form their culture, but they're much more of a community life in these areas than they would say in the northern colonies. Now, the other thing that you should get from this photograph here, this is later again. This I think is from even from the Reconstruction period or maybe right around the Civil War. But what you want to notice is that you have generations of people here. And this is an important aspect to understand about American slavery, which makes it different from other New World slavery in a lot of ways, and definitely makes it different from Old World slavery, because there was slavery in Africa, and there was slavery in other parts of the world, in the Middle East, and been going on for generations. And so what makes it different here is that you have generational slavery. So this what we're going to refer to as is the Creole slave population in British North America, meaning they're American-born slaves. So although if we went back to that chart that shows the importation numbers into British North America, it's not all that huge. And one of the reasons for why is they start to rely on a self-replicating slave population, a self-producing slave population. And something that is, again, unique to the New World and unique to the British colonies is that if your parents are a slave and you're born, you are automatically a slave. In other parts of the world, it didn't work like this. So usually you weren't a slave if you were born to the parents of slaves. It wasn't passed on generationally after generation. In the British North American colonies, both South, Middle, and North, it is passed on generation to generation. So those, I think, are two key aspects that you want to notice about slavery in North America, the British colonies in North America. Um, so what you start to see also that takes place throughout South and North is that they start to develop these special laws called slave codes. Um, and slave codes are going to stay with us all the way up until the Civil War. And even after the Civil War is over, Southern states are going to pass these laws called black codes, which are very similar to slave codes to try and reinforce uh, the rules for slaves. So the slave codes would say things like, you can't have more than 4 or 5 slaves congregating in the same place. They're all about kind of stopping rebellion from taking place among the slave population. So all of your colonies eventually are going to develop these forms of slave codes. And on Monday, one of the things we're going to do is take a look at what do they actually say in the slave codes, and how do they start to signify and identify being black in America and being a slave. Because eventually those two things are going to become synonymous by the early 1800s in American society. Early on, we know you had indentured servants and you had slaves coming from Africa, and sometimes they would work side by side. And so it wasn't always synonymous that a slave was black and a free person was white. But as society keeps going, it's going to move in that direction. Now, a big reason for the slave codes is really going to be because of rebellions. And so one of the most famous rebellions is a rebellion called the Stono Rebellion. And the Stono Rebellion happens in South Carolina in 1739. And what happens here is the slaves are trying to get to Spanish Florida. They want to escape. And the reason they're trying to get there is because the Spanish are offering basically any slaves who come from the British colonies. They said that they'll kind of get asylum there, they'll get their freedom if they're able to get there. So it's a little bit of European like interpolitics happening here because the Spanish have slavery themselves. It's not that they're against slavery. But what they're doing here is trying to just hurt the British in any way they possibly can. And so you have this march. It's pretty gruesome. The rebels here who try to rebel and overthrow, their white masters here in South Carolina, they kill, a decent amount of people. About 20 people are killed. Eventually, they're caught and executed, and they're dealt with very harshly. And the reason they're dealt with harshly is they're trying to stop other rebellions from taking place in these colonies. Because in a place like South Carolina and certain parts of Virginia, the slave population might outnumber the white population, say 3 to 1. And so there really is this fear of a slave uprising happening in certain parts of really the southern colonies, but also some of the middle colonies as well. All right, so what we're going to spend the rest of the screencast talking about is Northern slavery, which is something that usually gets totally ignored in a traditional American history class. So we're going to look at New England and the Middle colonies. So Middle colonies, just to reiterate, is Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Delaware. Now, Delaware kind of is like it's a middle colony in some ways, it's a southern colony in some ways. You can lump them in sometimes with the Chesapeake Bay because they do have a decent amount of slavery present there. Now, as far as the middle colonies are concerned, although it doesn't indicate it here on this map uh, too much, New York really has the biggest slave population in any of the northern colonies. So the middle colonies, New York and Pennsylvania, during the colonial period actually have some slaves. Not the same amount as say the southern colonies would, but more than New England is going to have. Now, when you look at the slave population, there's certain characteristics that are common. So we'll come back to this slide in a second. But when you analyze it, slaves in the middle colonies have some things in common with the southern slaves, and there's certain things that are different. So in, say, New York or Pennsylvania, they're going to be working in one of two places. They might be working on a farm, a grain farm, say like growing wheat or oats or something like that in a middle colony. Or they might end up working in a city environment. So when you look at this, the northern slavery is not exclusively agricultural slavery. That's what we always think of. We always think of agriculture. But in the north, it could be, you could be working in a city, or you could be on a rural farm. Now, this slide is supposed to show you that it's also not uncommon to be living alone in a northern colony. So you might be the only slave that a slave owner has, say in the middle colonies or in New England. So it's much less common that they're going to develop like a distinctive culture in the northern colonies because they're not meeting as much. Not that they're not meeting at all, but it's just not as common. Now, when you look at Manhattan, we actually had a decent amount of slaves working in Manhattan in the early 1700s. And another famous slave revolt that we don't really have too much time to go into happened in New York City in 1712. So if something that you find interesting, I would look it up, and just kind of research it on your own. So we're going to go into this much more in class on Monday and really kind of try and pick it apart and analyze it and analyze the culture that develops and why it develops. But hopefully you got an idea that you have slavery in all the colonies, New England the least, the middle some, and the South has the most. Okay? So I'll see you guys on Monday.